And I said, this is my first work of fiction. And he said, that's not true. Thank you all for coming and making the time. Happy Independence Day to everybody. Thank you to our author. Thank you to Krishna and to Bookworm for giving us this space. We will do it in this fashion. We will have Sondhi lay out his thesis for us. I've read through the book and it's structured in two ways. So there is an introduction where he makes the case that while civil-military relations are fraught in all nations, or at least all the nations that he's looked at, the nations and the militaries tend to respond in different fashion. And then he's looked at episodically India, Pakistan and Bangladesh and how the military and the civil institutions have responded to various episodes, many of which are in living memory. So perhaps we can start with about a 10-12 minute brief on the thesis, which makes up what is the introduction to the book.
Thank you, Aakar. Thank you, Krishna Aure, and thank you all of you for being here this evening. Means much to me, especially to be in Bookworm, one of my favorite bookstores in Bangalore. I was actually not expecting to deliver a monologue. When I spoke to Rashmi about who could really challenge me on this book, the first name that crossed my mind was Aakar, and I therefore recommended him to Krishna, and that's still on. But since I suppose it's customary for me to say a few things about the book, let me just lay out a few thoughts before we go into a conversation. I think firstly the timing is great as an author. Not that the things happening around us are great necessarily. Bangladesh is on boil. The former ISI chief in Pakistan has been arrested by the military, which is actually, as far as my research is concerned, breaking news. And all of this is happening in a sort of undercurrent of serious civil-military friction and relationships in both these countries in our neighborhood. Let me start with Bangladesh, since it's the elephant in the room, because in many ways what's happening there ties in with my larger research. I'm thankful to my editor, Karthik, that he asked me to add a chapter on Bangladesh. He was prescient, or maybe he just had intelligence on Dhaka that I didn't. And I added a 10,000 word chapter actually later. And it's a very interesting scenario because Bangladesh, as you know, was East Pakistan to begin with. And when partition happened on this ostensible two-nation Hindu-Muslim divide, obviously these were binaries that didn't apply on the ground. Pakistan was anything but a monolith or a homogeneous society, which is really the reason it's seen the trajectory that it has. A key factor in Pakistan, and Bangladesh included, is language. And when Pakistan was formed, the Urdu-speaking Indians who migrated were Mohajirs or outsiders. The Punjabi-speaking brethren, in some ways my country cousins, were the ones dominating the political landscape. And the turmoil there in terms of the divide between Punjabis, Sindhis, the Pathans, those from the NFWP, and critically with the Bengali-speaking Bangladeshis, was massive. And it was this sectarian, linguistic, some may say feudal polity that Pakistan inherited. They had Jinnah as an early leader, he passed. They had Liaquat, who was a good prime minister, he was assassinated. They had no elections for the first few years. Pakistan did not have a constitution till 1956. And I've always maintained that example of a golden hour during an accident, that golden hour of the first few years in the inception of a young country is critical. And I believe the DNA that Pakistan inherited and the DNA we inherited is markedly different when it comes to the role of the military. This is not a certification process to say who's done well and who's done better. That's besides the point. For me, the non-event of a coup in India, a military coup, is something to be talked about. We give credit to, active institutions. We give credit to actual events. But I do believe there is room in political theory to talk about non-events and why they didn't happen and how they have influenced the politics and the democracy of a country. So returning to Pakistan, poles apart, the contrast is so stark that in this early time of sectarian violence in Punjab, where else, the Governor General, as the executive, imposed martial law. There was no real basis for it. He had already selected Ayub Khan, who was then a brigadier, to be the chief of staff. Another very interesting, almost, theatrical development in Pakistan, you see. Every leader picks his own bete noir. Ayub was picked, Zia was picked by Bhutto, Musharraf was picked by Nawaz Sharif. Each of them showed them their place. But Ayub Khan was brought in. There was already some political adventurism there. But the fatal mistake that was made at the early part of Pakistan's history was that when these riots broke out in the Punjab, the army was brought in to quell the violence. And once the army was brought in, it was never going to get out. It came in a quasi-police role, but it was seen as a nationalistic savior institution. And it had greater credibility and, funnily enough, legitimacy within its people, which really it should not have. It should not have. The legitimacy and the credibility should have been of democratically elected governments, a constitution, which we had at that point in time. And the rest, as they say, is history. The army was there to stay. I don't want to go into too much detail, but quickly fast forward to Bangladesh in 71 and what's happening today, which is an interesting pattern, because this linguistic divide remained, the role of the military remained, and as such, this democratic deficit that was in Pakistan, this linguistic divide that was in Pakistan between Bangladesh or East Pakistan and the West, really led to these very, very radical outcomes, right? Literally the dismemberment of a country and the formation of Bangladesh. Now, Bangladesh becomes interesting because as much as Sheikh Mujib won a legitimate election. In fact, it was one of the most democratic elections that Pakistan has seen historically in 1970 and conducted under the auspices of General Yahya. One of the other great ironies in Pakistan that it's generals who've conducted the best elections and the civilian leaders who've been the biggest despots. But that said, after he won, he was imprisoned. In an ideal world, Pakistan should have had a prime minister in Sheikh Mujib ruling all of Pakistan from East Pakistan. Instead, what happened, it only further divided the military society, the polity, led to the war. Some say it was a sabotage by their own people in the West. And ultimately, Bangladesh was spun off with no little influence from us. We were the elephant in the room. Now, here's where it gets interesting. That Bangladesh was born as a democratic example. It was born as an affront to everything else that was happening in the West. But equally, it inherited the DNA of the West as well. And that is exactly what now, 50 odd years later, is playing out there. Because there are two Bangladeshes. I don't think we can have simplistic conclusions to say this is Bengali speaking, that is Punjabi speaking. It doesn't end there, I'm afraid. And in Bangladesh, and this has been Sheikh Hasina's sort of critical flaw, I think, or the reason for her falling, which is that she is still fixated with those who fought for the liberation of Bangladesh, to whom she is clearly more fond, and those who she very disparagingly called Razakars. And I think there's a lesson there. Even one word, somebody had said Guspeti, even one word used or misused can come back to bite you. And she has therefore today faced the results of many reasons that I'll probably talk about later. But clearly this divide which still continues to plague Bangladesh as to who is the real Bangladesh. Is it the one that was at some point attached to the West, or the born again Bangladesh, which was a liberation experiment that came true. And though she did a lot, she healed the economy. At some point, even now, perhaps, I believe the numbers that Bangladesh has is better than ours. But equally, which I think is the DNA that I return to, that the leaders in Pakistan, be it the East or the West, have somehow never really stepped up to that mold of being statesmen or stateswomen. They have somehow reverted to being despots of the highest order. And that is the irony in Pakistan as well. Bhutto Senior, Nawaz Sharif, to a degree, Benazir, have been very autocratic. They've been corrupt regimes. They've been very violent regimes. And as a result, though you've had civilian governance, you've not necessarily had democracy. And that has been the stick for the army to beat them with, to say, in a way, we are more democratic, we are more nationalistic, we are more fair, which are, trust me, they're not even half-truths, they're quarter-truths. But that is the bogey on which the army continues to legitimize itself. And that brings you to where we are today. You've got a caretaker government, which really the constitution doesn't recognize. You have Muhammad Yunus, who's a good man, sworn into power by the army chief. What business does the army chief have facilitating the transfer of power? But this is the DNA, that the army is always there. Willy-nilly, society will accept the role of the army, if not directly, certainly indirectly and behind the scenes. It's a lot more complex right now. The student groups are not willing to give the army more political space. It's not that folks want military law or military rule back. But the point is, these things never work in a straight line. And that is really my hypothesis, that once you give the military room in polity, then there's no logical end to it. And that's perhaps where we've been the better for it. With our flaws, with our serious flaws in our democracy today, we can still, I think, hold on to a few things, one of which is our early commitment to the Constitution. And I think this needs to be highlighted more and more. It's something we take for granted, maybe less now than we did some years ago. But that commitment to having a constitution, to having a civilian leadership in place early, keeping the army out, in fact, keeping the army out with a great degree of distrust that the leaders had at the time, has paid its own dividends in terms of at least letting us have enough space in our democracy to make sure that when the cracks occur, and trust me, these cracks occur periodically, the arbiter at that time is not the military. And that's really my conclusion. I'll stop with that by saying that when these serious sort of points of inflection happen in your democracy, like even the emergency with us, or Operation Blue Star that I write about, or the 62 war, those were textbook cases where in Pakistan the army would have usurped power. But for us, fortunately, we're still able to achieve a transition in a more, maybe I shouldn't say civilized, but in a more constitutional sense. And I think that's where the contrast between the two countries becomes glaring. I'll stop with that.
Thanks. That the violence of the 50s that he refers to in Pakistan, in Punjab, that brought the army into the polity, has many things in common with something that happened in our parts as well. There's a train going with these people who stop, and there is a clash between a community called the Ahmadiyya and the others who are Sunnis. And the violence begins from that one single episode on the train, but it escalates to the point that the army intervenes, and then with Mayub and Mirza before him takes over. Let me go back to something you've written, which I didn't realize till I saw it. You say that there were no officers in the Indian Army who were desis till the end of the First World War. So 1918 is when the war ends, and you write that because of the quality of the performance of the soldiery, they are deemed to have been rewarded in some sense by having commissions, and they become officers. What struck me was that somebody who would have been commissioned in, say, 1920 would still be a much younger man when this person would have become a general, and even a chief of army staff in both the countries. Nehru, who I think is 1889, is 10 years the senior of people like Cariappa, 15 years the senior of people like Timaya. To what extent does that one episode where you've got army chiefs very much younger than they would be today, in their 40s? Ayub, I think, was only 40 when he became the chief of the army staff there. To what extent does the age difference between the general and the politician determine the pathway?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I don't know how far the age divide mattered. I do know the fact that the early commissioned officers, the officers you mentioned on both sides, the fact that they served the empire, I think, was a huge factor. It was a factor with the civilian leadership here. And I know that Nehru and his ilk were very uncomfortable with the army for this reason more than the others, that it was somehow seen as having fought for a foreign force, right? And on the other hand, you had the INA, which is Subhash Bose's army, which was overtly political. And that could have been a ticking bomb. Had you integrated the rank and file of the INA into the Indian army at the time, it would have had a far greater political avatar than we did. This is exactly what Bangladesh grappled with. What do you do with the Mukti Bahini? They fought as basically a liberation, freedom fighting force. Their politics is known. And they had to keep them apart and keep them as a sort of a paramilitary adjunct and not bring them in. So I think it was more that factor that came in. The age, I'm not entirely sure of. In fact, if you see, Aakar, some of the early writings and utterances of Field Marshal Cariappa, at that point perhaps a brigadier and then, of course, a general, he actually spoke about an overt role for the army in governance. It's on the record. He suggested at partition that you have perhaps a commission, and I need to go back to that part, but he suggested some sort of a hybrid where you have Jinnah and Nehru as the civilian front of the government, and you had the two commanders-in-chief, as they called the chiefs then, of Pakistan, India, as part of the governing sort of establishment. Now, that's a frightening thought. Of course, he was quickly, practically laughed out of it by the establishment, and thereafter, to his defense, I will say everything the Field Marshal said was in keeping with the apolitical ethos of the army. So, despite the age, I think these officers actually made bold to let their views known. You talk about General Timaya, much younger, became a chief early, should have been the first CDS, should have been a Field Marshal had he lived longer. Despite the age or otherwise, his views on China, his views on the politics, as it were, the foreign affairs of the time, were very clear. And he didn't speak for himself, he spoke for the establishment. And had the civilian government had a little more trust and time for the leadership, you could have averted 1962.
I'll try and keep it as tight as I can, but it's a very vast book. We'll stick with India for the time being. One comment and a couple of questions. The comment being that Sondhi writes that even within the army, the higher leadership did not want the remnants of the INA to come into the army again, and they were kept out. The question is, could you tell us that bit about the CDS? Why did we not have a CDS in all this time, though it had been proposed in the period that Nehru was actually around?
Look, the proposal to have a CDS has been...
a chief of defense staff, somebody who oversees all three parts of the armed forces.
Which General Bipin Rawat was after his tenure as chief, and now you have General Chauhan as our second CDS. Now, this proposal to have a CDS was floating around, I think, from the 50s. And I said the name that was touted then was General Timaya, saying let him be CDS, because he was seen then as a one-shop stop, as a point of contact between the armed forces and the political leadership. And look, at that point in time, it was really the army that was dominating. You had an air force. You didn't even have an active navy per se. The navy really came into the picture a little later. 71 is where the navy asserted and made its presence felt militaristically. But even then it was felt that you need to have this one shop stop where the government can speak to the armed forces and build civil-military relations. Those can be matters relating to pure military decisions, or they can be matters relating even to the demands of the military themselves, pay scales, promotions, etc., all of which have actually been serious boiling points in our military history. There have been many instances where there have been supersessions and so on, which could have led to a far greater reaction from the armed forces, which fortunately didn't happen. But look, this is where, and I write about this, one of the reasons India was able to resist any adventurism from the military was because of our counter-coup decisions or processes, or the measures we took, right? These were very clearly done. These are not accidents. And one of those counter-coup mechanisms was to have a strong bureaucracy. And that bureaucracy then acted as a buffer between the politician and the general, right? So this is very interesting. Even the civilian leadership wanted to distance itself from the army by having this buffer, the red tape, as you will, of the executive, so that there is no real direct osmosis between the way the military thinks and the way politicians think. And that can easily flare up, as you're seeing. And the CDS, therefore, you look at some of the things that have been said about General Bipin Rawat, right? The CDS was supposed to cure a lot of these things. But he has been described, and I think Sushant Singh uses that phrase, super general, super bureaucrat, right? Many of his utterances were political. I've documented them. He discounted the role of the IAF, right? He, in many ways, people have said, spoke only for the army, when ironically the CDS is supposed to be at arm's length from all three forces. So that is actually is very counterintuitive. It's directly opposite to what the CDS is supposed to do. And if the CDS has the ear of the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister, etc., it's good in a way, because you're on the same page, but it also means a lot of these coup balancing measures, the intermediary steps, the bureaucracy, etc., go out of the picture. And if you have then an aggressive or an adventurous CDS, things can go quickly wrong. And I think it was exactly for that reason that for the longest time, though this was touted, certainly the Congress government was never in favor of having a CDS, because they worried that this would actually create a single, you know what happened to Session. When Session was the single chief election commissioner, the government hated him. And the whole idea of having a collegium, as it were, of election commissioners was brought in to clip his wings. And if I can draw that analogy, I think in some ways the government felt happier dealing with three chiefs than with one.
Just to go back again, you write that in the first decade after 47, defense is not a glamorous job. It's not a job seen with a job having the prestige as home, finance, or industry. I think that's the third one you mentioned. Why was that, and why does it change?
Look, that was because the government at the time didn't really treat the military as a serious enough organization. I think the government felt that the battles were behind us, that partition was done. You had the episode in 1948 in Kashmir where the army acquitted itself very well, which is how the transition of power happened from the Maharaja to the government, the integration. And thereafter, the mistake that the early leadership made till 62 was that the fixation was with Pakistan. And the sense was that we were militaristically stronger and that we'd be able to quell any challenge from Pakistan. Obviously, there were other commitments, and to give credit to the government, for you to budget, to balance your budget, you had to think of a great deal of other nation-building priorities than just the military at that point. But in the process, I think the government took its eye off the ball. And with intelligence and advice from the army, right from perhaps 57 onwards, that China was the elephant in the room, nobody really listened, right? Krishna Menon was an aggressive defense minister, a brilliant mind, but an alpha male. And I've said this, there are too many alpha males in the plot at that time. The generals back then were assertive individuals. General Timaya had a great sort of personality. His troops loved him, right? And he felt that he had the credibility to tell the Prime Minister one-on-one that you have to pay attention to China, but nobody really listened. And how did that change? The second part of your question, well, I think directly because of 1962. We got a terrible spanking. We lost officers and soldiers in a theater where we should not have. We could have preempted it, or at the very least, we could have been better prepared for it. But that's when I think the penny dropped. The government realized two things. One was that operationally you need to do better. You need better shoes, you need better fighting equipment, you need better uniforms, right? You need more money into defense. Secondly, I think the government realized that you do need to listen to your generals. And this is at a time, by the way, when in the neighborhood, Ayub Khan is a field marshal come president. He's ruling the roost. There's a direct coup. So I think this is when the government perhaps woke up. And then if you look at the next decade, I'd say 62 to 71, you see that marked change in civil-military relations. You see how much more seriously the government takes its officers, how much more was being invested in terms of funds, leading up, I think, to our finest hour, perhaps, which was 71, when you could have officers and ministers speak very freely, and speak freely on matters both of policy and of operation. That's not to say the army was double guessing whether we needed to go into Bangladesh as such, but in terms of timing even, right? The decision taken to go into war in December rather than January was really a decision that came from the armed forces. And yeah.
Sorry, you write that the army acquitted itself quite well in 47-48, and you allude to the fact that perhaps had the fighting or the skirmishing been allowed to carry on longer by India, we went to the UN and we sought a ceasefire, it might have been the case that the army might have taken more land. Is that the case?
I think so. And if you look at some of the biographies of the officers from the time, that was exactly what they were pushing for. They in fact felt that was the one time to solve the Kashmir problem, as it were, right? That didn't happen. I also think that was a crucial time in comparison to Pakistan, because we never really invited the army in to do anything apart fight that localized battle.
We'll come to that when we get to AFSPA.
To AFSPA,
you write, so two things. Since you mentioned him, what is the effect of, there doesn't seem to be as much whining about it from the army once the defeat has been internalized. And you write about why that is, and you speculate, and could you please tell us these two things? Thank you.
Yeah. So your second question first. I wouldn't use the word whining at all, because there have been, that's not to say there haven't been complaints. If you read even General Cardozo's book, you read Major Provel's book, which is an authority on 62. You read General Bogi Sen. There are a whole bunch of very, very credible literature on all of these. You look at the way the army responded to 62, not just 62, IPKF. Ridiculous operation for the army. Operation Blue Star, an op that should have never had the army involved, and much less have Sikh officers being sent in to the Gurudwara. So they were not whining, but there were complaints galore, and there was certainly heartburn on many of these, Kargil for that matter. But I do think there is that ethos of an officer and a gentleman, which was imbued by then enough to know that these complaints were to be made either in private, or were to be made through the appropriate channels, or were to be made post-retirement when you wrote your memoirs, which is, I think, the three broad ways in which I have seen these grievances work out. Not once have I really seen this being precipitated to anything beyond that. Your first question is interesting. How did Ayub's decade there influence us? It didn't influence us directly, but if you look at Jairam Ramesh, he's written a book where he talks very interestingly, I think he brings out aspects that others have not. And he says, look, there's no doubt that in the late 50s, cocktail conversation, which apparently drives most policy in Delhi, cocktail conversation was very much about when are we going to have a coup in India, right? Because Pakistan mein to ho gaya hai, right? And in some ways, it was a subconscious fear that the army was going to take over. But from whatever I've seen, a lot of this is anecdotal. A lot of these light-hearted comments about Nehru asking Timmy, what's in the lower drawer in your desk? And he says, oh, that's my plan to take you over. Now, this is a bit of sort of British public school humor, I would say. Or Sam Manekshaw saying, my nose is long because I know what you're thinking, Mrs. Gandhi. But I think a lot of this is a bit of banter. There was nothing ever really structural which suggested that the army had any such plans. So I think the fear factor, if you will, was more with the civilian government. The army, I think, had put its head down, was doing its job. It had its grievances, no doubt, about a lot of things that I've said, but none of those really took on a political avatar.
You write that it's only one army unit, I think 4 Corps, is named and shamed for 62. The policies that precede the fighting are not spoken about, not discussed. How are we to understand why the soldiers would not be upset by such a conclusion of a war that they've lost, where particularly in hindsight, but also at that time it was felt that the political leadership had failed in equal measure?
Look, I also think it was a bit of a reality check. I think it might be General Candith or General Cardozo, one of them, it's in the book. They actually have a sub-chapter dedicated to how, had the army wanted to orchestrate a coup, it could have. I mean, it tells you people have thought about it. And they actually talk very clinically, maybe hypothetically, but clinically about saying, you need to take over the All India radio stations. You need to take over a couple of crucial, cantonments in the city, and there you are. But equally, it's a reality check because I think it's simplistic. India is a vast country, right? We have no tradition of a coup. You have no precedent of a coup. You have zero legitimacy, and trust me, that counts. How much ever you may fantasize about things like this, I don't think the army in India was seen as a savior institution. It was in some ways seen as a very responsible nationalistic institution, no doubt, but really had no role or cred when it came to governance. So if you knew this is how the cookie crumbles here, of course soldiers were upset. Of course generals were upset. The Henderson Brooks report, which was basically buried, the Kargil Review Committee report, which came out so late that it didn't matter, death by committee, basically. All of these actually lay out a very, very cocktail scenario where you see multiple failings. You see failings of the military itself. Let's not, make this black and white. There was serious leadership deficits from the army. These have been written about. You read General Sardesh Pandey's book on IPKF. He calls out his own colleagues, right, and very responsibly. So there were leadership shortfalls. You had serious intelligence flaws. And look, intelligence is not just military intelligence. It's IB raw, right, in all cases. And of course, you had civilian apathy and failings there. And this is exactly the cracks that I talk about. These are the cracks that have happened with us. Let's not assume they've not happened. These cracks were there in 62. They were there in emergency. They were there periodically, even before and after. But the point is, the response is what matters. And I think for being, however upset people were, there were resignations. You know the episode with General Kaul and General Timaya, there were super sessions and so on. But I think for the many reasons that I've tried to flesh out in the book, the response was never political.
And when harsh action is taken, it appears that the army accepts it and will swallow it. I'll skip a little bit to Blue Star, where you write that Sikh soldiers, and there's a very large number of them, are upset by the events in the Golden Temple and they mutiny. They mob up, they fire in the air, but it doesn't either become some sort of template to be replicated, nor does the army condone it in the way that you would think it might. Why is that? I think what is it about the system that gets an episode of this level of violence back to normalcy in a relatively brief period?
Yeah. That takes me back to the point I earlier made. which is what is your DNA. If it's in your DNA to accept the military as a political player, you're going to do it. And sometimes you're going to do it at the drop of a hat, which is why the army chief and the ISI are still central movers in Pakistan, even though they're not in power, which is why General Wakar is the one who's sort of practically swearing in the caretaker government, because it's acceptable. When you speak of Blue Star, I think we're so far gone. We're 40 years into democracy and constitutional democracy that by then it's practically unfathomable. And if there is a revolt or there is a reaction somewhere, it's supposed to be an outlier. It's supposed to be stemmed then and there. And the reaction was interesting. I mean, as much as I think bringing in the army in both Blue Star as also in IPKF were actually very serious tactical errors, strategic errors that the government made. But the reactions also were interesting. You had General Brar, who commanded that op in Blue Star, right? He was a Sikh. He spoke to his own officers. It was a very interesting experiment. And he says, I read in his book, he says that I asked my own boys, they were all officers. He said, look, if any of you want to pull out, because it is our own sanctum sanctorum, I will let it be. And he said, not a single hand went up. In fact, hands went up saying, no, we'll go in first. So it's an ethos.
You write that the only general who dissents against the operation is a non-Sikh, and he is sort of AFSPA. So my education ended with Article 32, but you say that there is a mechanism in the Constitution for martial law or something resembling martial law to be imposed in India. So could you just walk us through that? Also, it seems to me, reading your book, it should have been clearer to me earlier that the political governments in India have used AFSPA to have calibrated martial law in places. And
in everything that we talk about, especially in India, because it's against the grain. The Indian Constitution, let me be clear, has no provision for martial law. It has a passing reference in Article 34 which says that the state may make rules or legislation with respect to the rights and liabilities of officers at a time when martial law is in force. This has slipped into the Constitution. Lawyers here in the group would agree that to impose martial law, you need a substantive standalone provision, which we don't have. And you can't superimpose or read it in to parts of the Constitution. Now, that said, this is where the tail wags the dog. AFSPA was brought in by an amendment, different irony. The amendment was brought in to say, to provide for the army in aid to civil power. Right? I'm paraphrasing slightly, but this is what it says. What is aid to civil power? What Ayub Khan did in 53-54 was aid to civil power. That's exactly why Pakistan has had military rule for half of its life. So it was a dangerous experiment. The moment you speak about the military being involved in aid to civil authority, you're actually legitimizing a role. And this came not so much from the army, it came from the government. It's a parliamentary amendment. And that brought AFSPA. And AFSPA in its specifics is really a subset, if you will, of martial law. The role, it may be limited to states. It may have been facing Assam, the Northeast and Kashmir, perhaps. But imagine if you had AFSPA across the country. You would have quasi-military rule. And just one point here. The reason I say this is that the role of the army under AFSPA then transcends its military role. It gets into not just policing, it gets in, practically speaking, into governance. And once you've done that, according to me, you've opened the door. But ironically, this came from the civilian government. And many times chiefs, General Padmanabhan and others have written, withdraw AFSPA. But the resistance was from the government itself.
Hypothetically, what stops a prime minister from declaring a large part of the country, say South India or West India, disturbed and impose AFSPA on it?
Actually, it's doable, right?
In law.
Yes, in law, it's doable. The object of the act is to introduce the role for the army in disturbed areas. The preamble says it was meant only for 6 or 7 states, no doubt. But the definition of disturbed area, it's in an act. That act can be amended. And who decides what is a disturbed area? The executive. And if the executive takes it, and this is very interesting. even in Pakistan or in Bangladesh, oftentimes military rule has been imposed at the highest levels. It is recognized in the Constitution of Pakistan, in the 73 Constitution, as an emergency power. We have emergency powers in our Constitution, 356 and so on. None of them provide for martial law. So what you cannot do under the Constitution, certainly you cannot do under a subordinate act. But that's how AFSPA is. That's been its legal criticism, that the power is so lopsided that it doesn't even have to go to Parliament. It can be an amendment or in many cases an executive decision as to what is a disturbed area.
Can you very briefly describe for those of us who don't know what powers AFSPA confers on the army?
Okay, this is a tough cross-examination. But very, very briefly, look, it really gives the army the power to go into what you call disturbed areas, to be armed and to act in self-defense to the extent of even taking the life of an individual. And though the criteria are broadly spelled out, there is immunity then provided for all of these actions. But I've been more interested in the manner in which AFSPA has worked on the ground. And if you look at the very extensive writing, especially on Kashmir, it's fascinating because the role of the army transcends all of this. It becomes quasi-government, it administers, it has very interesting collateral roles to play in, municipal laws. So for example, in Kashmir, if I remember, there is an act which deals with forest land.
Anuradha's book.
Anuradha's book. And when, thank you, you've read every page. Even in matters which you would think are purely civilian, what area is a municipal area, what is forest land, etc., you actually have the army playing a role. And this is where Anuradha Bhasin, she makes this interesting comment that you're actually letting in the army into areas where it never belonged. For me, here is the red flag with AFSPA. The human rights abuses, of course, and we'll talk about them, but politically, the red flag is here. That why is it that the army in Pakistan stays and chooses to stay in power? It's not out of great national love and patriotism. It's because you have economies of scale. You have interests in land. You own banks. I'm told they even manufacture sort of cereal and toothpaste and so on. So you have a parallel economy that the army controls, and that's big money. And according to me, these are the red flags for the government to say, you don't want the army. I must say, to the credit of the Indian Army, at least in that direction, their role has been okay. The human rights balance sheet we'll talk about. But in that direction, the role has been okay. But the moment you get into administering and letting colonel rank, sorry colonel, I'm saying this, but having a colonel or a brigadier deciding on matters which should be decided really by elected leaders, you're diluting democracy.
The book, there's a book by this woman called Ayesha Siddiqa that he also refers to, which details how the Pakistan army has captured the non-military aspects of the state. In 2024, to your mind, are we past the time ever in our history where we can fear a military takeover? A, B, is the maturing of a nation a linear process? Do we become more mature in time, or is it the case that we might suddenly slip back into a period like Bangladesh was in the 70s or Pakistan was in the 50s?
I think our last election will tell us that the electorate thinks we went too far, and which is why the rollback, right? I think there's a lesson for everyone that however powerful or popular you may be, the moment you start getting autocratic, you're going to be shown the door. And many times the outcomes are far more serious, right? So I don't think it's a straight line at all. I think it's a big zigzag, and the question is, how do you equalize? But are we past it? I can't say an absolute yes. If you had asked me this question, say 10, 12 years ago, I would have said yes. And I have a short chapter on 2014 and beyond, where I try and uncover some of the slightly sharper developments that have happened with the military, which do not sit well with some of these traditions that I'm talking about. One, I've already told you, the role of the CDS, right? That was really not what was expected. And some of his political utterances in Kashmir, etc., really, I mean, even politicians perhaps sometimes would not speak that language. Secondly, is an increasing politicization of the army in a subtle way. I cannot say it's direct or overt. This is both from within and from without. It's from within in a different sense, because every institution, I think, in India over the last 10 years, perforce decided that it needed to belong to some sort of ideology, political, religious, which is really not necessary. There is no reason for courts or the bureaucracy, or for the media for that matter, to have any institutional ideology. But we've seen it's come in. Everyone, RBI governor to whoever, has some sort of baggage that they're carrying. That has permeated into the army. There's no doubt about it. How deeply is a different question. The second thing is from the without. I think some of you must have read selfie points have been introduced, where officers are required to say good things about the government. And say good things not about defense military decisions, but about governance in general. And to have, soldiers going back to their homes, this is literally mandated. It's come from the defense ministry. Speak about the good work that the government is doing. This is not a role for the military at all. It's a very dangerous thing to do. And look, I'm not saying this. The veterans are saying this. Please read Admiral Arun Prakash, General Wambatkere, General Panag. Please read their writings on this. They've said now you're becoming social warriors. Right? This is a phrase General Panag has used. General Wambatkere points to Rule 20 of the service rules to say no army man or any officer or a soldier shall have any sort of political affiliation. How does that sit with it? And to me, these are hugely avoidable steps. They may be seemingly innocuous, but this is where I'm saying learn your lessons. You have immediate neighbors. You don't have to go beyond to Myanmar or Turkey or Philippines. Look at Pakistan. Look at Bangladesh. Bangladesh, for all of its civilian government, has had two serious and violent military rule regimes, right? General Irshad and before him, the namesake, General Ziaur Rahman. What were they doing there? So, yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Let's move to Pakistan. The two traditional reasons that are assumed for having let Pakistan slip into military rule are one, that Jinnah died early, 6 months after Gandhi goes, and then there's nobody in the leadership and the Muslim League is weak, and the army is the only proper institution functioning as we know from the Madras sappers since 1780, and so it just naturally assumes or takes over more responsibility than the state could take on. And the second reason usually cited is that it faces a neighbor much larger from which it feels a threat, and it's because of this defensive posture, not just in the state but also in the population, that the army is given more authority and power and more leeway than it would have been in another state. How do you respond to these?
Yeah, look, they're both spot on. The India bogey has really been the sheet anchor for the army in Pakistan to justify its continuance. And in a funny way, we're playing into it. Some of the things our politicians have said over the last couple of years about reversing partition and so on are actually feeding into that narrative, right? And Pakistan has long believed that it is India's unstated policy to reverse partition, to reintegrate Pakistan into India. Of course, then we'd win a gold medal in javelin. And then what happened, this is in a lighter vein, by the way, since we have a camera on. And our role in 1971 in the liberation of Bangladesh was also used to say, look, India was behind it, and as we were, apart from other forces. And that has always been the sort of the justification for the army to say, look, we are the ones who are going to save you. And that's become easier in a way for the army because of the hapless track record that the civilian governments have provided. I don't blame them entirely because they've not inherited, and this is the first part of the answer. You've not inherited a tradition of democracy. You've not inherited institutions. Look, how much ever we are focused on the last 10 years, if we look at our extended history, and I'm glad we're talking on Independence Day, you look at our extended history over the last 77 years, we've done well institutionally. right? You've had institutions that have held the fold. You've had the Supreme Court, you've had an election commission, you've had an objective bureaucracy, you've had a police force that's held its own, and of course the army. And all of that, with the flaws that are inbuilt, have fed your tradition of democracy and constitutionalism. And every time you've gone off the track, you've had someone to pull you back. I don't want to make this a legal lecture, but the Supreme Court declaring the basic structure as the cutoff for you to amend. The point is, people have accepted that judgment. It was a 7-6 judgment. In Pakistan, a basic structure doctrine may not be accepted, though we trace, funnily enough, our basic structure from a judgment of the Pakistan Supreme Court, right? But I'm saying, if your first civilian government really is, say, Zia after 71, you've already had 24 years of army rule. The rot has set in. You don't have a court that's asserting itself. You have a constitution that came, got suspended, got abrogated, then you got a fresh Islamic constitution in 73. You have an identity crisis. And therefore a civilian leadership then has its work cut out. Coupled with the fact that, power corrupts, you probably know you're there for a short while. And that's really, you're spot on in saying these are the two reasons, the India bogey and the absence of any constitutional base or tradition to fall back on.
Does the state in India have any kind of agency on this to at least try and define the latter aspect? The feeling of a threat and insecurity?
That's a question for Mr. Ajit Doval, I think.
Have you in your time studying this subject felt that there was ever a period in India where the state was inclined in India towards trying to make things more normal through the lessening of the threat?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this was Bhutto's pitch, right? When he came into power, and Bhutto was this is Benazir's father I'm talking about, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. The whole Shimla agreement and the negotiation was a big win for Pakistan. And the entire premise of his negotiation was that I am your last chance for democracy. And when he says your chance to us, in a funny way, he's bringing us together into an extended subcontinent. He's saying peace and democracy in Pakistan is good for India. And in a way it is, right? Pakistan, these skirmishes at the border, they have been a historical headache, regardless of who starts and who ends, right? So, and that did prevail. And for sure, from whatever I've researched, with a little bit of intervention from the US, the return to democracy by facilitating Bhutto, or the emergence of democracy in Bangladesh, clearly had India's hand. I won't even say it's a hidden hand. It was a stated position that the presence or the return to democracy in our neighbors is good for us. Now, how we did that covertly, I am afraid I can't answer.
So Simla basically says that both states agreed to talk to resolve disputes. And secondly, if I'm not wrong, Bhutto does not press on the 93,000 soldiers coming back, and they remain in central India for some time to come.
He gets a repatriation.
Yes. How does the Pakistani army survive the events of 71 in terms of reputation? Because only 5 years later you've got a coup and Bhutto's hanged.
Yeah.
How does that happen in such a short period of time?
Yeah, that's I think a very interesting part in Pakistan's history, because that is perhaps the first time where the army suffers a serious legitimacy crisis. And people in Pakistan begin to say, look, your job, boss, was to be fighting wars and fighting them better. You haven't done that. And you've been sort of poking your nose in politics and governance where you don't belong. And that was a dark hour for the army, right? It was a dark hour also because of the shame of losing Bangladesh, losing to India, the disgrace of the handover that happened. And I was disturbed to read that memorial in Bangladesh, I believe, has been broken down, which is sad. All of this had its own serious symbolisms. It cut very deep with the army, and some of the contrarian literature that has come out, Brigadier Zahir Alam Khan, a Bangalore boy, in fact, writes this fascinating book called The Way It Was, and it cost him his promotion, where he really speaks of a sabotage within the Pakistan establishment and the army. And these are people who fought the war to say, look, our instructions were duplicitous. Something, this is why I draw the example. The same duplicitous instructions the army had in Sri Lanka. Were you a peacekeeping force or were you a fighting force? But, people died, there was the same disgrace there, maybe a slightly smaller level, but none of that blew up politically. But in Pakistan, it blew up in a completely different way. People said, we are now ready for civilian government. The army has no business, and which is why Bhutto was given his 5 years. But the problem is, Bhutto had this acute distrust of the army because of everything that had happened. He set up his own parallel paramilitary force. The mistake that Sheikh Mujib made with the Mukti Bahini, it became an affront to the army. We did it, by the way, the BSF, etc. If you read Seaborn and Catherine Frank, they tell you why the BSF and paramilitaries were brought in, so that if the army turned on you.
No, since you mentioned her, you write, and I went back to her book to check if you had got the name wrong. You said that Rajiv Gandhi, she writes that Rajiv Gandhi had planned the Blue Star operation with his cronies and not
That
Sanjay.
would be Sanjay. That would be Sanjay Gandhi.
It says Rajiv in your book and in her book as well.
In her book?
Yeah.
Okay, then the typo is hers.
Yeah.
Catherine Frank.
That the Home Minister, I think the name is Sinha, says to Parliament in his book that there is nothing being planned of the sort, not knowing that wherever they were staying, Tughlaq Road or wherever, Racecourse Road, this was actually happening. My last question on Pakistan before we move to the audience, could you explain to us how the nature of the Pakistani military's intrusion into the state has changed over 60 years, from being the total takeover, capture of like Ayub, to now where it seems to be a kind of hybrid sort of model?
Yeah, actually hybrid is the word. Because when Imran won his election, people said it's a hybrid government. And hybrid as in civil military. He was propped up by the army. But that's always the soap opera that is Pakistan, that the one you prop up takes on a completely schizophrenic avatar. And Imran was in many ways seen as the army's boy, right? Supported. It was seen as also a return to democracy. And remember, we're focusing on an Indo-Pakistan relationship here, but Pakistan has had many other fires to put out like it does now. Afghanistan, the post-9/11 crisis with the US, right? And the pressures from there, China. Now, this hybrid arrangement, the army always thought would work well. General Bajwa was brought in. At one point, he and Imran had a great working relationship, but things went quickly south. So much so that now the overthrow of Imran also was orchestrated in many ways by the non-state actors, if you will. But the question, yes, the question still remains, why is the army not back in power per se, though it's obviously lurking? I think the reasons are manifold. I think one of the things I've seen is that corresponding precedents in other countries are dwindling. It's difficult for the army to justify overt military rule. You have a younger populace which no longer buys some of this, right? I think a lot of younger Pakistanis, from what I've read, say we're done with this narrative. India is the threat, army is the savior. You have to take the discourse beyond. You have to take it to jobs. You have to take it to climate and a larger global presence, social media. So I think that's where the army has perhaps smelt the coffee. It's also a bit of self-preservation. Because look, with every coup, you may kid yourself by saying it's constitutional, and that's the part I've enjoyed in my own research. You'll see it, every single chapter in Pakistan starts with a quote from a general who says, look, trust me, I'm not here to rule. Democracy is meant for the people. My role is to transition to the constitution and the government. And then you stay put for 10, 11 years, right? All of them have said it. Musharraf, Ayub, Ershad in Bangladesh, Zia, Bajwa, they have all said this publicly. But that's just a Freudian sort of thing that they say to console themselves. But I think now the coffee is being smelled, saying, if you see the lawyers' movement, right? Musharraf was practically overthrown because of that, right? And people have realized that civil society movements, the Bangladesh example, after two brutal eras of military rule, civil society, a stronger media, better governance, better institutions, a better economics, were becoming the blueprint. And therefore, perhaps at one level, the army has realized that it could be end game. If you're going to experiment, and if this backfires, it's going to end very badly, right? And it's going to end violently as well. So I think a little bit of realpolitik there, perhaps.
Praveen Soni has written about how the army has also been accommodated formally into the higher decision-making process, particularly when it comes to national security and nuclear weapons. The lawyers' movement, for those who might not know, about a quarter century ago, this Chief Justice called Chaudhary was sacked, and lawyers in Pakistan, the Wukla, they came onto the street, and this man from the PPP, I think he wasn't in the PPP at that point in time, Etzaz Ahmed, led these, processions which got the army to back off.